Hi there and welcome. I am grateful that you are joining me today on the Delight Your Marriage podcast. I don't know if you've been here before, but we talk about all sorts of things that matter to your marriage, whether it is physical intimacy. I get really specific on things as much as I can be on a public podcast like this. Emotional intimacy, spiritual intimacy, and all those combining, and how God uses marriage for His glory. And today I want to talk about abuse some more. We are on our third part of this series. And this is one that I want you to know very clearly from the get-go. I am still processing. I was made aware yesterday, actually, that I hadn't, there was still a big deficit in my ability to articulate this topic, which I think is a good thing. And that's why I kind of wanted to talk about it with you today, because I think sometimes we think that we've got things figured out, and then experiences happen and we're like, oh, I did not have that all tied up in a nice package and bow, and so it's good. I mean, God challenges us and He tweaks our understandings of things. And I also think that sometimes God uses people at different times in history, and He also uses certain understandings at different times in history that propelled the ability of the next time in history. So, for example, I would say a lot of the early Christians, and I don't know enough about biblical history to give you names or whatever, but, a lot of them thought about sex in a certain way that I don't think is the right way to think about it. But that doesn't null and void all the ways that they did do God's work and think, things that were so helpful to the kingdom of God. And it also doesn't null and void. Maybe if they hadn't thought about sex in this way, there wouldn't have been a response to then think about sex in another way, that then ultimately, what I believe, God has given me the capacity and capability to think about sex in this way, and maybe the next generation, or you, the person that's listening to it on the podcast, is then able to think about sex in this way, a different way, a little bit in your own marriage. So I in no way think that my opinions and my voice and my stories and the way I even share all of these thoughts is the last word on it. I am not God, and I don't have all the background and all the accolades and all this stuff to tell you that I know everything, because I don't. God has certainly taught me quite a lot, and I think my doubt on my own opinions is helpful for me to have better opinions than I've had in the past. But I don't think that we are supposed to hold our opinions with a big, firm grip. I think it should be more with an open hand, that God's going to mold us and shape us and change us and teach us. This is a side note, but I think that's what's so scary about things like social media, is when we put stuff out there, we have this pull to be consistent. We have like a tug on our personhood to be consistent with what we said yesterday or 2 years ago or whatever. So it's really hard to change, because that's in text somewhere in the internet. It's going to be there forever, and it feels very vulnerable to change. But if we're not vulnerable, we can't change. If we're not willing to go there and be vulnerable. And so that's why, I am strong and confident on what I say, because I think God has given me some help that'll help some people on the other end. But I will say that at the same time, these are things that, God's got to discern, you've got to discern with God about what applies to you. And I want you to know that this is something I'm still processing, but I think it's really important to talk about. All right, so that's my little introduction as we dive in. What happened yesterday is my church, I live in New York City, and I have an incredible, incredible church. They have walked with me through the hardest times with my husband and I, and they've taken care of my kids. They've treated me so kindly when I was in the hospital multiple times, and they've treated my family so kindly, and they've been just unbelievable. It's been incredible. They're also not a perfect church, like every church is not a perfect church, and we're all just trying to follow Jesus the way that he calls us to. But so my church was broadcasting a conference in California in my pastor's living room, and what happened was there's a woman, a black woman, who was preaching about women in church and how there's not representation in leadership for women. And I was really, I felt very encouraged by a lot of the things that she talked about, because she was really focused on that women are equal to men. There's not, it's not a true biblical notion in the context of the Bible that women are not equal. And yet, sadly, men have misinterpreted scripture to mean that they are equal, or they are unequal, and men are the higher beings. And I don't believe that's scriptural. And it was really powerful to hear this woman speak. Now, after the discussion, after her teaching, there was an opportunity to discuss. And so once again, we're all in my pastor's home, and we actually have two pastors of our church, a husband and a wife, and they, opened up the conversation. What does it mean to, what does this mean to you? The question from the seminar, from the conference in California, the question was, how does your opinion differ from, or how does your perspective differ from what you just heard? And so it's actually a very vulnerable question, because here you just heard someone who's got a sociology degree, who has authored books, who's authored Bible studies about this particular topic, who knows very intimately the material, and you're just kind of coming in cold, and you're asked to say, well, I have a different perspective. But me, I like to forge into hard territory. So I went ahead and, discussed what I felt was kind of, where I differed in some of the things she said. But what I will say, and what I wish the first question was, is in what ways were you aligned with her perspective? Because I had 2 full pages of, I had a small journal, but 2 pages of journal notes that aligned with what she said. So I kind of wish I was able to discuss that first. But then I went with the vulnerable way of saying, something that I felt like I didn't articulate well. In fact, I don't think that if I had heard the recording of myself played back, that I would have agreed with what I said. Because I guess maybe because I was uncomfortable on answering the question, how did my perspective differ? And I hadn't thought it through. And this woman clearly has a ton of experience that I don't. So who am I to differ? So I stumbled through trying to say something, and unfortunately, another woman cut me off to explain what the speaker had been meaning. And during the explanation of our church friend who cut me off, I felt a lot of emotion, and I needed to go process that. And so when she finished her explanation, I got up and I went into the other room with my journal, and I started to write out what was going on. And I started to cry a bit because there was a lot of emotion for me, because this topic is near and dear to my heart. Not only because of the trauma I've experienced in my abusive marriage, not only that, but also my being abused by church leaders, though it wasn't sexual abuse, just to be clear. I have not experienced that, though many have. But it was abuse, for sure. And but then also the fact that I speak to you on this podcast, there's a lot of weight to I'm very invested in my opinions on this, because if I don't have the right opinions on it, then here I am proliferating things that are actually hurting people and making them, feel more in bondage rather than, and helping them to feel free in the ways God wants them to be. And then I think the other piece of it was a good amount of pride of, like, here I've done a lot of work on this. I've taken sociology classes myself, and my degree was in philosophy. I've taken feminist classes. I was just watching a feminist documentary the other day, and, I'm very, I feel I'm adequately able to say these things, and I feel like I articulated myself very poorly. And I guess on top of that, the fact that she interrupted me and I wasn't able to even explain myself. So, and I guess probably the final thing was the condescending tone of her voice and explaining to me some things that are incredibly rudimentary that I felt invalidated all of my experience. All right, so that's kind of how I processed things. And the reason I was able to process those things the way that I just did with you is actually my pastor came in and she asked me if I was okay. And I was able to process those things with her. And she was able to help me think through, like, maybe being curious why it matters to me what people think of my opinion, and how does it matter to me if people disagree with me. And I think a lot of it is wrapped up in this podcast that, I speak to you. And so you can't speak back and say, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me, or that, no. So there's that. And maybe the pride of just people listen to this podcast and I, get to the spot of like, well, I must be right about all these things. And, but then also the concern that if I'm wrong, like, what is that doing to the woman on the other side of this call? Or what is it doing to the pastors that listen, of being validated in the way they treat their women in the churches, So yeah, I feel like keeping my opinions with an open hand is really vital. And I want to encourage you on the other end of this conversation that you keep your opinions with an open hand and you ask God to help you discern and process this the right way. I told you that I don't have a wife. My pastor is a woman. I have a woman pastor and a man pastor, and she preaches on Sunday, and he preaches on Sunday. There's actually 4 people that preach on Sundays. They rotate. And so we get to hear from women. And, we just did a series actually on women in the Bible that they called it Hidden Figures, I think. And there are many stories I had never heard of women in the Bible. And you might think, well, haven't you read the whole Bible before, Bella? And I don't think I have. And I will say that I have certainly read a lot of the Bible, but I definitely have more to read and learn, but these, my pastors, actually, all of them, the three men and the woman, the teaching team is there's two pastors, which is the man and the woman, but the teaching team, the three men and the woman, all taught on women in the Bible and how important they were. They were prophetesses, and there was a woman who was a mystic in the Old Testament. There was a woman that killed a king, and there was a woman that prophesied the demise of a kingdom, and that the king specifically went to for help. And there was the prophets in the Bible that even Paul, I think it was Paul that talked about these women that were prophets. And there's just so much. I mean, Jesus was the one that even made sure that Martha and Mary were taught just like men. He was supporting feminism like it never could have been seen in that context, in that culture ever. Women are important to God's work in this world. And if they are not given leadership in churches, if they are not permitted to be leadership in churches, I think we need to keep our opinions with an open hand. I think we need to be thinking about context. I think we need to be thinking about a lot, because there's a lot that women have that men don't. And there's a lot that men have that women don't. But we both lack when either of us are absent. I think in the context of a church. So what I was trying to articulate in this setting yesterday was something along the lines of the uniquenesses in natures of men and women, and how, yes, they are equal, but they are not the same. Husbands and wives are equal, but they are not the same. I talk about Strengths Finder test a lot. I don't know if you've heard me talk about it before, but there's this test that I kind of adore, and it's called Strengths Finder. And you take this test, and it's like $20 at the most, I think, online. And then it tells you basically your top 5 strengths out of 34 strengths. And this is like a business test. So they've got Gallup poll, I think, is the company that puts it on. So it's all based on like tons and tons of research and data from businesses. But I think it is incredibly powerful in your own life, because it helps you to navigate like, oh, okay, these are my strengths. So I need to stop worrying about my weaknesses and focus on my strengths. So I'll tell you, my strengths are activator, positivity, communicator, and strategy. And I think there might be one more. Did I just say 5? Activator, positivity. Oh, and communicator. Did I say that? Okay, well, I think I got them all in there. Oh, futuristic. That was the one I didn't say. Futuristic. So when I talk to you, those are kind of the bigger strategies, the bigger strengths that I'm speaking out of. Like activator is kind of helping you to change, getting you to move, getting you to do and act and change. And the positivity is like, this can happen. I am optimistic. I believe. I have faith. That's kind of a natural proclivity for me. The other one is communication, which obviously I'm constantly doing when you and I talk. The other one is futuristic, which I believe helps me to talk to you about the future of what your marriage could look like and give you hope for it, and think about, being wise now so that in the future it's going to matter. And then strategy, lastly, is how to get there. How can we navigate these waters that are currently happening to get to where we want to go? So that's kind of my view of my strengths as far as I understand that God's given me. So, and I continue to cultivate and I continue to refine and be careful with. So I encourage you to go ahead and take that test because it would give you a lot of insight, I believe, to your strengths. But as men and women, there are also strengths and weaknesses and kind of our nature that are different. And the reason I think it's really important to realize the difference in natures is because if you do not, you are probably like that's essentially what I was kind of trying to articulate, is that, if we're just the same as, men, then what does it matter whether or not women are in leadership? They're just the same. It just turns out that person's a woman, that one's a man. Like, it doesn't really matter. But the thing is, it does, because women are different than men. Men are different than women. We have uniquenesses, which is important. But I also don't want to say that it is, generalizing. So part of what this podcast has to be about is generalizations, because I'm talking to a broad audience. I'm not talking one-on-one with you like I would be in coaching, but because it is generalizing, I will say that God has given women specific natures that are incredibly amazing. Receptivity and trusting and kindness and character and genuineness. I mean, these are lots of generalizations, but God uses women in different ways than he uses men. And whether or not you want to agree with that in terms of what's kind of the nature of all women, is totally fine. Let's just take it as, how did Jesus care about women? Well, it's interesting because I let my husband listen to the first half of this podcast, and he just gave me like a million examples of how Jesus was very specific to bring women into the conversation over and over and over again. So what about the parables that he had of that included women? Like, what about the woman who gave the money at the temple, who she gave her last 2 pennies when the Pharisees gave a lot of money, the rich people, but she gave far more because she gave everything that she had. And he said that she was the most righteous. And then what about, the woman that was supposed to be stoned to death because of the adultery? He was the one that stood up for her and said, anyone who is clean among you, cast the first stone. Someone who has no sin, cast the first stone. He just constantly protected women, constantly. And, the Me Too movement. So think about the woman who poured out the expensive perfume and wiped her hair on Jesus's feet and washed his feet with her tears. The disciples looked at her with disgust, and knowing that she was a prostitute, and saying, Jesus, why are you letting such a woman do this? And Jesus said that she would be remembered. For everyone that hears the gospel, they would remember her. And her her lavishness of love on him. Like, that was what is appropriate, that lavishness of love, and why was Jesus born of a woman? Like, why did that matter that Mary was the one that birthed Jesus? And why did it matter that Elizabeth was her cousin and she birthed John the Baptist? Why are mothers so important to God and to Jesus' story? So women are vital. Somehow, somewhere, it's not the same. We are not the same as men, but we are equal. And Jesus, once again, protected women over and over and over again. Even when he was on the cross, he made sure that someone was going to be taking care of his mother. That those women that were standing there that were honoring him were going to be taken care of. And in that day and age, they needed that. His mother needed someone to be taking care of her. How often does it talk about taking care of the widows and the poor and the orphans? Women are really important to Jesus, really important to God. And I just think about, so this Me Too movement, I don't know all the details of it, but a lot of what I do know, I'm very, very grateful for, because so many women have suffered for so long, and they've had to suffer in silence. There is so much sexual abuse in this world, and men of God should be on the forefront of protecting women. That is what Jesus was about. Protecting women, because God has got a unique and important assignment for women. Once again, Jesus first came to women. The angel first came to women to say, "Here I am." That Jesus was raised from the dead. Women were the first ones evangelizing, I guess, if that's the term, bringing the good news to the disciples, to say they were the ones that trusted first. There are reasons that God has for women that are unique, but equal. Not to say they're better, not to demonize men. But men should be all about the movement to help women to feel empowered, to not feel ashamed if they've been sexually abused or molested or treated poorly or sexually harassed. It is so common for so many women to feel that way, to feel marginalized, to feel abused, to have been raped, to have been date raped, to have been assumed that, she must have wanted it because she was acting that way or being treated that way, or she was wearing that thing. Probably she was completely oblivious to the whole concept, which might be, for a lot of men, they can't believe that could be true, but more than likely she's oblivious, because that's just the way, that's just kind of, there's a lot of underneath reasons for that, but that'll take a long time to go into, so I won't, but anyway, I just want to kind of stress once again that we are unique, but we are equal to men. And I think we should be represented in such a way in all facets of society and all facets of the church. And I think that any place that a woman is lacking if they want to be the full body of Christ, because we are all image bearers of God. It says that he made them man and woman in his image. He could have just said he made man. But for some reason he said, I made man and woman in my image. So anyway, to circle back to the story with my friend from church, after processing with my pastor for a while and crying a bit more and journaling praying, and again, remembering that this is such an important topic for me, and I believe for you on the other end of this phone. And I went to church the next day. So the broadcast was on Saturday. I recorded half of this Sunday morning, and then went to church, and then I actually walked into church a bit late because I was recording that morning, and I ran into the woman that I had the kind of negative response with the day before. And she hugged me and she said, "Oh, Bella, if I offended you, because of my big mouth, I just want to apologize. I didn't mean to hurt you." And, and I was like, thank you. I was like, "Can I tell you how I felt?" And honestly, that was even vulnerable to say, because it's hard to talk about your feelings, especially like trying to be honest, trying to do real life together. And she's like, "Yeah, absolutely." And so we sat down, and honestly, she was a little too close for me. I wasn't comfortable enough to be quite that physically close because I was still kind of emotional about it all. So I said, do you think you could give me a little bit of space? Which again is vulnerable and is hard to like just be honest with yourself. Like, I'm not going to be able to share what's really going on in me if I can't have, a few things in place. So anyway, I then shared like, here's the background I'm coming with, philosophy major and feminist epistemology, and I just have the background and X, Y, and Z, and then the trauma in my marriage, and the, trauma in churches, and with male leadership, and just different negative experiences that, not to mention just male-dominated society and feeling oppressed in different workplaces. And, the way that I felt that I was talked to yesterday, I felt, kind of condescended, and I kind of felt like I was misunderstood, and then I wasn't able to explain myself because I was cut off, and, I felt like my background was invalidated, and I wasn't, maybe I wasn't even smart because I didn't understand what she was trying to say. And, it really affected me. And I tried to get it all out there. I really did. I also tried to do it as respectfully as possible. And she listened, and she gave me the space, and she looked at me and she's like, "Bella, I'm so sorry. I didn't, when we were talking in the, yesterday, I guess I was thinking about like, everyone's just going to share their opinions. We're not really trying to all align. We're just throwing out ideas or, what we're thinking about or whatever. And, I don't, I didn't agree 100% with the woman either. And, I don't feel like I said the things the right way either." And, she and I were just kind of both kind of in a spot of like, we both feel like we didn't feel great about what we said or how we said it. And, anyway, what I think was important is that we had the conversation. I think that's called messy life. That's called messy, honest church. I think it's important. And I think that women having those kinds of conversations are really important in churches. So the end of the story is that I'm really grateful she's in my life. She's taught me a lot of things just over the years. And it was an experience I needed to have. I needed to process how I felt about these things. And it was hard, and my emotions got in it, and that's messy. And, it was in front of people, and that's messy, and it's uncomfortable, but that's important. I mean, Jesus obviously wants us to be all in it, He showed his emotions. He wasn't unwilling to be, quote, weak in our society standards. He cried. He was moved, He honored those who felt emotion. who had faith, who trusted, and who were disappointed and who were sad. And, he didn't think that was weak. He honored that. So anyway, I guess these are all things for you to ponder. Whether you have struggled to feel like you were equal, whether you have struggled to understand if feminism is the direction that you should be going as a Christian, or if, as a 21st century woman, are you, what does that mean to being married? And I definitely have a lot of things to say about that. Or, what kind of leadership positions are you, quote, allowed to have in the church, or that kind of thing. I mean, certainly these are all things for you to be discerning, but from where I sit, God made us unique but equal. And so I do not feel called to be a pastor, but I believe there are many out there that have excluded themselves from that calling, and I don't know if that's what God would have wanted them to have done. But there are plenty of other ministries that I think they have also not started all by themselves because they were waiting for a man to pick them. And I think that is very wrong. So yeah, I think I'll explain that last point one more time, is that just because you're not, quote, picked in a church to be some kind of leadership doesn't mean that you can't just go out and start your own ministry. Delight Your Marriage was started with, $20? I don't know. My brother bought me the microphone. I happen to have I'm looking at my husband to see if I'm right. I happen to have a small, very tiny computer. Oh yeah. And the mic stand. I used an oatmeal box. I cut up an oatmeal box and used that as a mic stand. And, I can't remember what that one was. We're playing charades. There was something else that I guess we used. Oh, and inside the oatmeal box were rocks so that it wouldn't fall over. And then the computer I used for editing was very old and small, and the screen was quite small as well to figure out how to edit the things. And I don't even remember what the actual budget was to start a website, and I learned how to do all the website stuff myself, and on and on and on. That's just a small example, but your ministry doesn't have to be started with more than $100. You can just start and see what God's going to do through that. So don't exclude yourself because someone didn't, quote, pick you. Some man didn't pick you. You can pick yourself if that's what God is calling you to do. And when I say calling you, if he's encouraging you, if you just feel passionate about it, that very well may be what God is asking you to do right now. And the best thing to do is start and just see if it's right. God bless you. I hope that this has been encouraging and helpful to think, where have I not been permitting myself to go because I thought I wasn't allowed to be there? Jesus wanted women in all sorts of places that they weren't, quote, allowed to be, or all of that. And he also protected them. Anyway, they're unique, but equal. God bless you. We will talk again next week. Thank you so much for joining me. Love ya. Bye.